So to help us break this down, we've got Becca Wasser, she's Bloomberg Economics Defense Lead, and Chris Kennedy, he is the lead for economic statecraft. Becca, I want to start with you because I know you've been covering this stockpile and its depletion and where we are with these numbers. How real is the concern over the defensive missile supply for the U.S.? It seems interesting, if these reports are accurate, that the U.S. is now prescribing policy based on the integrity of the supply.
Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where right now in the course of the conflict, there is a huge strain on U.S. air defense interceptors. That's not to say that the U.S. does not have any left, but rather that there's a clear strain on the existing stockpiles, which are running low after, this extended conflict with Iran, in part because of the sheer need, not only from the United States, which is trying to protect bases and troops and some U.S. allies in the region, but also the allies themselves, who have depleted most of their air defense stockpiles and have been asking the United States for more. So at the end of the day, it's a pretty stark place to be in, but it's not necessarily the only thing that is dictating U.S. military policy. We've seen this song and dance before, where President Trump has threatened high escalation only to step back at the last moment to leave some room for diplomacy. We've also seen President Trump enter into feints in the past, where he's said that there will be no strikes, only to go ahead with that large operation. However, from my experience, if I'm looking at things right now, the U.S. does not have sufficient defenses to weather the blowback that would likely come from Iran if the U.S. were to rapidly and extremely ramp up this conflict.
We'll get to Chris Kennedy here in just a minute, but Becca, one more question to you as I look at your most recent piece for Bloomberg on all of this. You write, the U.S. lacks the munitions depth to bomb Iran in perpetuity. The bigger risk is the U.S. may run low of the right kinds of missiles. Help me understand what we know and what we don't know. My understanding is the size and scale of these arsenals is classified. We have some sense of what the U.S. has. How blind are we when it comes to kind of assessing what the U.S. has at its disposal?
We're pretty blind, but I think there are a few different rules of thumb that we can always rely on. We've seen, at least in the initial fighting during Operation Epic Fury, U.S. officials said that there were over 13,000 munitions that were expended, and most of those were some of these higher-end, long-range missiles that are in demand all over the globe. And so the U.S. is likely having wound down some of its stockpiles for those critical munitions, which means that it is either likely going to need to pull some of those missiles from other regions like the Indo-Pacific, which could leave a potential gap for others to exploit, or try and find ways to bolster the production of munitions, which the U.S. is doing, but that's a slow-moving effort. We are talking months, if not years, to try and just produce a few more of some of those most advanced missiles and munitions.
Wow. Chris Kennedy, thank you for hanging in there. We do want to ask you more about the economic impact of all this, because oil hit $100 a barrel for the first time in weeks. We now have concerns not only about what's going on in the Strait as it seems to drag on and just the cost of doing business with this level of instability, but now you have these threats from the Houthis, which is compromising exports not only in the Red Sea, but possibly production within Saudi Arabia. They can and have before hit refineries and facilities there. What is your take on that second front, and if we're going to see that, if we have seen that start to price in the markets?
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge. So the Red Sea is now, been the subject of several different attacks by the Houthis. I just looked at the recent tanker traffic through the Red Sea, and it is dropping over the past few days. Of course, many ships might be traveling without their transponders on, so it'll take a few days to really see what the impact has been on traffic. But we are getting anecdotal reports about ships turning around, having to traverse the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and that just adds time to get oil to market. On top of the Middle East conflict, we've also seen Ukraine ramp up its attacks on Russian oil export infrastructure, tankers. And so that's another bit of pressure that's been growing in the background as this conflict has continued.
Becca, you gamed out sort of what the president and his team might be thinking about when it comes to the future of this war. And you came up with three options. The U.S. could continue to bomb Iran, could intensify the blockade and guidance of ships, or could launch an operation to forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I wonder if you could kind of put those in order of likelihood as you see it, maybe order of difficulty as well, and where you think the administration might be headed right now.
I think the administration is firmly in that first bucket. They're looking at ways to potentially intensify the air war, to launch additional air and missile strikes against Iran, because that's the playbook that the president has relied upon. But at this juncture in the conflict, the president is starting to feel pressure where he probably needs to do something different, in part because some of those economic pressures that Chris has mentioned. So if that's the case, there's, the two additional options. One would be to try and enforce the blockade even further. But really, with that, try and make it so that the U.S. can get more ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which is becoming even more of a choke point than it already was. That means that the U.S. military would need to shift to a direct escort mission, which is something that is incredibly resource intensive and may not necessarily be on the table at this point in time. And then the last one is a operation to open the strait, and that requires putting boots on the ground in Iranian soil. It is high risk, it is resource intensive, and once that happens, the escalation in this conflict is likely to go sky high. And that's where the conversation that we've been having about air defense interceptors is so important, because those troops would need to be protected as best possible, as well as other U.S. forces and allies across the region. In addition to that, the U.S. could also potentially look at entering the fray in the Red Sea. That would further overstretch U.S. forces and assets, particularly some of those air defense missiles, too.
Chris, we also have another front that is really impacting the price of oil, and that's the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Russia, and how Ukrainian drones are penetrating Russian defenses and getting to hit these manufacturing and refining facilities. But now also you have reports potentially of Ukraine going after an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Everything is connected when you look at global economies, but also when you look at politics. And as the economic statecraft lead, those seem to fold in nicely together. What is your take on how these two conflicts are antagonizing each other and working together to kind of make it at a hard time for oil prices kind of even more difficult? Where do you see this going?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, the Iranians did not respond well to Ukraine's targeting of this particular ship, which I believe Ukraine said that it was involved in the transfer of weapons between the two countries, Russia and Iran. I do think what we're seeing is this pressure building on the global energy system. So just stepping back, the U.S. publishes weekly updates on energy inventories, oil inventories. We're probably going to see a 16th straight week of oil stocks falling in the United States. We had a little bit of respite from this MOU period. We saw commercial stockpiles rise a little bit, but these releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve have continued unabated. So we're estimating that those releases will essentially run out by October. It's possible the U.S. could offer another release. But these stocks are limited. And so the additional pressure, Russia has banned the export of diesel because of these attacks. Russia historically has provided about 10% of the global exported diesel supply. So that's a pretty significant hit. It hits the real economy everywhere. Another unknown is how long China can continue to effectively pause many of its oil imports. And we don't really know what's going on in China, but they've certainly helped to act as a buffer for the global energy system over the past 5 months by essentially dropping off 40% of their imports from the world. So there are all of these different variables. Some are uncertain. Many of them are outside of the control of this president, certainly, and they're going to be adding pressure to his decision making.
Becca, as I'm listening to Chris, I'm still stuck on something you said, which is about the U.S. kind of engaging with the Houthis, and my mind wanders back to April of 2025 when we saw the U.S. do that, and there was that moment when I think a Super Hornet fell off the USS Harry Truman into the ocean. It was a difficult fight that they were waging there, and I wonder sort of what that portends about the U.S. kind of re-engaging in that way. How difficult would it be for the U.S. to fight the Houthis, who have kind of reared their heads here several months into this conflict?
That's a great question. Let's think about what happened last time. You mentioned that there were aircraft that rolled off the deck of a carrier and were lost at sea. But there was also over 1,000 U.S. airstrikes on Yemen at that time, which ate into munition stockpiles. Additionally, U.S. air and naval forces shot down over 480 Houthi drones, and that left stockpiles pretty low for some of the important air defense interceptors as well, with U.S. Navy officials saying that they cost in the billions of dollars and that stockpiles were nearly depleted. And that was just from some of these one-off attacks from the Houthis during that time period. Right now, if the U.S. were to enter the fray, it would be like that once again. But that also means that that's occurring at the same time that the U.S. is prosecuting a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz and using munitions and equipment and readiness to, conduct that, as well as continuing its air campaign against Iran, which has been paused for 2 nights, but could pick up at any moment, which again is depleting critical readiness, using U.S. forces, and using up some of the most important munitions that the U.S. might need in a potential future conflict.
And Chris, it's not just complicating supplies of munitions and oil, but other commodities as well. I see you retweeting a friend of the show, Stephen Shasinski, who we had on yesterday, him talking about LNG. He said a global fight for LNG is brewing and Europe is losing. Europe's strategy of delaying LNG purchases until Hormuz reopens is backfiring, threatening efforts to refill storage for winter. What is going on there and how critical is this?
This is a really serious issue for Europe. Of course, the U.S. is in pretty good shape for LNG. And if we could export more, but we're really capped out at how much we can export right now and help to backfill for Europe and other economies. I think the challenge right now is that Europe is competing with Asian economies that are also trying to ensure that they have sufficient supplies of LNG, which goes into everything from power generation to petrochemical manufacturing. So, Europe is in a position where they need to start, resupplying their stocks before the winter. They can't count on Russia, of course, and there's limited amounts of export from the U.S. So, if this conflict doesn't resolve, if we don't get these LNG, supplies coming out of the Gulf again, it's gonna cause some pain in Europe. And I'll also note that we saw early in the war that Iran targeted some of Qatar's LNG facilities, and these are very sensitive facilities. And if they are subject to significant, kinetic attacks, that could cause, long periods of them being offline. So that's, I think, one of the bigger risks of further escalation at this point.
Chris, we only have a couple of seconds, but before we go, is it we can't export more because we lack the trains or the facilities to convert it into a movable quantity, or is it shipping, or where's the rub there?
It's these export facilities, so these LNG export terminals. Okay. So between now and the next 5 years, we're expecting to be able to double our export capacity. But right now, the U.S. is drowning in LNG, and we just can't get it out fast enough.